Committee. Thank you for those in attendance. Hopefully we get one more to make this truly official. Could you go to the next slide, please? So we've had a pretty active work plan over the past year. We had our, and Zach, you might like that I called it our Super Bowl, because I kind of saw the EM performance metrics as kind of the pinnacle of what we're trying to accomplish here. So that one's actually a very big highlight for me personally, because it kind of really sums a lot of things up. And I think we won the Super Bowl this year, by the way.
Thank you guys win every year.
and I don't have to do any other football jokes, but since the last committee got out of hand. And then we also spoke about the National Environmental Research Park, and that was a big Tom French push who introduced me to this topic last January as we were setting out this work plan. So November, in my opinion, was an excellent month for this committee, because it was not that the other topics are any less important or radiant as these two, but I felt they were very fruitful, especially learning more about the NERP aspect of the site. It's something I had never really taken into context before then. So it's been a banner year. I look forward to helping the future chair of this committee, so it is going to be open. So if you are interested in running, please self-nominate or talk to James, because we need good, high-caliber, energetic people. So, and you all showed up, so that's a huge plus in your favor. So anyway, let's get started with the information. And there we go. We got quorum. So thank you, Mary. I was banking on you, wasn't I?
Yeah.
See?
No, you were.
I was.
Yeah.
Like, she'll be here any second.
I was here last week.
Yeah, I'm sure nobody liked that.
Points for that.
Okay, so with that, let's just go ahead and jump into our point of contact. Zach Todd, give his update.
Zach Todd,
lots has happened in the last 2 weeks, right?
Lots has happened in the 2 weeks, but I like to think of it as an opportunity for you guys to maybe go in debt with some of these topics that we usually talk about with the strategic plan, budget, military, that sort of stuff. So maybe we can get some interesting questions with that. But like you said, a lot has changed in 2 weeks, not so much. But 19, as you well know, that the budget was approved. I know we keep saying, but it's really we're not quite sure what to do with our hands at this point, because we have an approved budget. Usually for like my organization, this is a very busy time of year, trying to get a continuous resolution, either extended, pass, or a final budget approved, and we're not doing all that this year, and it's actually been pretty great, and I'm sure the programs appreciate knowing exactly what the year it looked like for them. You got to think, normally the ball's been getting punted, back to your football references, and the can kicked down the road, where these programs, they're not entirely sure what the year is going to look like for them, and when they get their budget approved, oftentimes it's tougher than to spend all the dollars that they're allocated for the year. So it's a very good thing that we got our budget approved prior to the start of the fiscal year. For fiscal year 20 budget, we just, I don't want to say completely, doing our OMB passback, where we get our targets and stuff through OMB, and based off those targets, we'll either write appeals, justifications, or comments based off of those preliminary targets. We can't get into the specifics of that, but that process is kind of ongoing right now. We're hoping that come the very beginning of the year, we'll start finalizing the 20 budgets, and where we start working towards the final presidential budget request. It's an ideal. And then additionally, we'll start working on the 21 budget around that time as well. Something that's kind of going on throughout the site, I don't know if it's been mentioned a lot. I think I've heard it once or twice in passing, but kind of like Jim's program, the liquid waste, the security contract is up for renewal, and there's been a team formed that they're kind of going through that, and they're again, just like Jim's in the liquid waste program, they're going through the review of the scope and coming up with all the requirements and stuff for the contract to place it out for a bid. Again, we can't get into the specifics of it, but it's an ongoing process, and look for that to kind of start taking shape in the coming year or two. The 10-year review, I know John Lopez kind of, he pinched it for me last committee meeting. He spoke of the 10-year strategic plan. Well, there's 3 avenues that we're looking at. We're looking at an ideal 10-year time window where, like, if money was no option, if we can lift certain restraints, how much work can we actually accomplish on the site. There was more of a handcuffed 10-year review where we look at, like, we don't change the regulatory environment conditions and things of that nature, so it's a little bit more handcuffed, and we worry about things that more so we can control, how much work we can get done. And then we have what is kind of our baseline, which is our ILCE, as we typically refer to, and that's like our life cycle cost throughout all the rest of the site's mission. We have a cost and the scope and stuff for that. So Anne-Marie White, our new EM1, when she came on, she started looking very hard into the strategic initiatives, and she's trying to look across the complex and gain efficiencies, and how can we start making investments and develop these business cases and investment cases within the next 10 years and actually get things done, and maybe take care of some of those like carrying costs that we have throughout the site. So, and she's looking at this on a complex level. So for us, all these facilities that we have that are not being D&D'd, there is a support cost to make sure that they're safe, because we're not going to have, like, buildings just collapsing and stuff around site. We want it to be in a controlled manner. So there's an upkeep cost with all these facilities. And that's just one example. There's a lot of different things that we're looking at, but that's something that everyone can kind of visualize. So the idea is we're going to take these, we're going to present the business cases, and hopefully that leads to increased budgets and stuff. Again, it's not the path that it's going, but that's kind of like, ideally, this is what it looks like. Hey, if you give us X amount of dollars, we can get rid of these facilities, or we can do this piece of scope, and we can save you this much money over the life cycle, is the aim of those documents, is the way that we're looking at them. Lastly, South Carolina National Guard. I know John mentioned that the 750 acres, that has been signed, sealed, delivered, so the South Carolina National Guard is, I guess, officially a tenant of the site. So military training has been ongoing. Again, it's primarily special operation type units. We do have some conventional units that have completed, like, small projects throughout the summer and are used in the area just for really just to muster and conduct a movement to get them out of, like, their drill halls, like. But I do want, there's a notable moment for us. We actually have a training exercise that the lab is going to be conducting that is going to be conducted on the South Carolina National Guard's land now. So it's just a different dynamic. Not much has changed as far as the process. It's really no change. It's just kind of I guess, a significant or a symbolic moment that there's going to be a training exercise conducted on the South Carolina National Guard's land by DOE, or hosted by DOE. So I thought it'd be interesting, and I'd share it with you. But would love to kind of go in depth if you guys have any questions on it, since, again, like Dan has pointed out, not too much has changed in the past 2 weeks.
Even so, Doug has questions.
Hey, that's good.
Doug Howard Cap. With that land being given to the South Carolina National Guard, does SRS still have the responsibility of I guess we just talked about the treatment of the herbicides and insecticides on the plants and trees and stuff like that?
Yeah, so this is going to be a little bit of a guess on my part, but I think it's an educated guess. I got the expert back here, Jim, so he can kind of step in and tell me if I'm wrong. But first off, let me clarify. We didn't give it to him. It's really like a long-term lease. So even though it's called a permit, it's a long-term lease. So it's still federal property, and we will have, I guess, overall responsibility for it in the end. So for the next X period of years, the South Carolina National Guard, it's their responsibility to maintain it. And I believe they have to do that within all standards of the site. Is that kind of the direction that we were going with, Jim? Or is it yeah, more or less? Okay.
Thank you.
David?
Thank you, Zach. Two questions. First, when John Lopez was here last committee meeting, he talked about the strategic plans and said that EM was moving forward with their strategic plan, and it may be completed even before the DOE plan is completed. The DOE plan we were expecting to see back in February, and we still haven't seen that one. Is there, and I know we have a recommendation for the SRS plan. We still haven't seen that one, and I know you have to wait for the other plans to so that you can make sure that they align with the ones that are in the hierarchy. Any dates on any of the strategic plans at this point from DOE, EM, or SRS?
Not specifically. Kind of like you said, John said, they're working on it. I don't have an exact date on it. I can tell you that we have a very good strategic plan that was fixing to be approved prior to the change in administration and kind of the holdups and stuff. And you know, with this 10-year strategic plan, we're getting a little bit more clarity. I don't want to commit to anything, but I don't think it's once those plans are completed, and as long as they're not like radically different, I wouldn't think it's going to take us too long to complete our plan. We have some things on the shelf. We have some directions that we've been getting in the meantime with in absence of the DOE strategic and the EM strategic plan. But no, I'm sorry, I don't have a specific date on you. I know there's rumblings and there's conversations, but that's all I have.
You talked about the budgets. Regarding the FY20 budget, the President has mentioned that he would like to see a 5% cut for all the agencies. Have you all been working on any scenarios that takes a look at that and what the impact might be on Savannah River site if there were 5% cuts across the board?
So I can't mention specifically any type of numbers or scenarios that we work, but I can tell you we do a wide variety or wide amount of different scenarios where it's pie in the sky, it's the worst day ever, it's the best day ever, and we kind of go back and forth through all these different scenarios. But I can't mention anything specifically for fiscal year 20.
Thank you.
Dan Kaminsky, CAB. You had mentioned on EM1's efficiencies and comparing the upkeep costs to D&D to finalize the engagement of that particular building or parcel or whatever it may be. Do we have any analysis that says that maybe the CAB could be shown that if we spend $1 million to close this today, we save $3.5 million over the next 10 years, 20 years in upkeep costs? Or is that part of the strategic plan that you guys are developing now for her?
Yeah, I mean, we have the idea of what the costs and stuff for the maintain these buildings. And I don't want to get too much in depth because it's not my program, but kind of generally speaking, you know, you look at the current budget climate where we don't have like money to like complete certain ongoing missions right now. It's unless it's specifically mentioned or specifically comes down, it's a tough ask to you know, D&D a building that might have like a $3 million carrying cost or $3 million a year carrying cost, and this is pure hypothetical, but it takes $50 million to D&D. It's tough to make that business case. I'm sure there's some facilities and stuff out there, and I think we can look at that. I don't know what all we can share, but I think it's a good line. I think we can look down that, and it might be even something interesting to kind of go through a presentation and stuff on as we get closer to the work plan.
Probably would be interesting for the CAB to understand how that budgets, those recommendations go forward, because needless to say, if you have a specific area to remediate or plow under, whatever the case is, it probably would behoove us to understand how that thought process goes.
No, absolutely. And And I think we should really kind of bring this back up, come the work plan. You look in previous years, or obviously with, I mean, it's y'all's decision, but I think it might be a good item for y'all to look at. You look at this past fiscal year, you know, Savannah River site was cut from our presidential budget request or enacted, and you looked at certain sites, say Oak Ridge, and I think there was a smaller site out in like near Berkeley, California. They were actually plussed up significant dollar-wise to deal specifically with D&D of these buildings. So I think it's a good line that might need to be explored further.
So in speaking to that topic you just pointed out, on the other sites, I'm assuming that at some point DOE sits back and says if it's better to blitz one particular site over another to wrap it up and move on to the next. I mean, sort of like the snowball debt thing Dave Ramsey teaches, get rid of the littlest one and attack the next one and attack the next one, et cetera,
Right.
et cetera.
Yeah.
So is that some of the methodology that we're aware of?
You know, I don't have a lot of insight on that, but I can say, like, just an observation on my part. The EM mission at the sites that are being blitzed, sort of say, they're not ongoing missions. It looks like they're wrapping up and trying to get out. Savannah River site has an enduring, as we see it today, an enduring EM mission for a lot longer time frame than most of these sites that are being plussed up.
So thinking in discussion with the cab here, so if that is the case, I mean, we probably would have a better context of what's going on at Savannah River site, why we seem to have people on the cab and others get a little incensed that others are being plussed up while we're lagging behind or limping along, I guess, with either just barely getting our budgets or having them slightly cut. And even though we got more money than last year, that's always a positive for sure, but you can see your goal grow away from you if you're not growing fast enough too. Maybe that's an area that DOE should give us a bigger picture perspective as to how these cards play out with the other sites. Because I know several members, including our chair, get really snaky that we're not getting our fair share of money, and me as a U.S. citizen would say, well, as a U.S. citizen, I would want my money spent in the wisest possible way, and that if that is to get rid of a site, close her down so you don't have those carrying costs and all those headaches to go and then take that budget the following year to the next sites. In the long run, it would get us to our goal perhaps quicker than we think, though the short term, we look like we're taking a cut. Doug.
Doug Howard, Cap. Well, if that is the part of the rationale, then that'd be fine. But at our chairs meeting, one of the points that was brought up was the reason why SRS didn't get the funding that we should be getting is because of the politicians, you know, and the political scenario. So what is the real reason? You know, it would be great to know and understand that.
I'm sure DOE wouldn't be at liberty to say it's political.
Well, absolutely.
But I guess if it is the other, if they actually have a strategy behind it, I think this cab would like to know that.
So just kind of speaking in generals again on kind of how the budget process works, and then you guys can kind of deduce from this. Every year we put forward our request, and our request is typically needs-based with a little, adjustment from headquarters based off of what some very, very preliminary targets of what they have a realistic case at getting. And as we kind of move throughout the years, we get these different targets based off of administration goals, and I guess some strategic inputs from our leaders based off of like the conversations and stuff that you're probably referring to. And a lot of those things feed these, like the 10-year strategic plan, I imagine will ultimately feed into some of these conversations. Then after all that, it comes together in the president's budget request, and this is very like in a nutshell and very loose, so don't like start nixing me, Dan. Based off that, it's voted on like who gets the dollars and how. So we always try to present to our best ability a needs-based budget for the upcoming or for that upcoming fiscal year, and then there's a lot of things that happen in between based off strategic guidance and then ultimately voted on by politicians in Congress.
David?
Zach, if we could just try to I looked at the conference report for FY19 for the Department of Energy, and I discussed this with John Lopez at our last committee meeting, and I compared FY19 versus FY18, and Savannah Riverside was up 5.7%, did better than any of the other sites. The next closest was WIP, which was up 5.4% year over year, fiscal year over fiscal year. Oak Ridge was up 2.4%. Hanford, 0.2% increase. Idaho National Lab was down 0.2%. So when you look at the fiscal year over fiscal year, then Savannah Riverside did fairly well in FY19.
So I just want to make sure I understand. You're just comparing like the aggregate sum of...
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to look at dollars, right? We go back to needs base and scope. I could say like for again another hypothetical situation, right? You have a site that's getting, we'll just say, $1 billion a year, and 300 million of that is a construction project, and the very next year after they can finish that construction project, it's 700,000, and it looks like they went down. It's not really detrimental. It's the construction or that mission, that scope went away. So I think it's important to look at the components of the sum in that. I know Jim can say, nuclear materials can say, like their programs, there's needs there, and there's an impact. So yeah, while like if you look at our aggregate 5.7, a lot of those other sites, they don't have the pension contribution issues that we do, so our buying power is reduced. A lot of them have like some of the same infrastructure issues, but I don't know if any of them quite to our degree. So there's a lot of things that are baked into that number that it can look favorable on paper, but that's not necessarily how it works out. I don't know if that helped or hurt what you're...
So James, one thing I'm seeing out of this is I feel this committee would benefit from seeing some sort of timeline, side-by-side overlap of the various sites. So we're slated, what, 2065 or 2065? We would, in theory, close our doors.
So really kind of like a life cycle of the EM program.
Yeah, I mean, if we could see a bigger picture, I don't know what's doable. I think it puts some context to it. I mean, it's easy to blame politicians because we're never happy with any of them, right? But I feel if we look at it from a more knowledge base, that it's okay. Well, if any of those other sites were slated to close in the next year or two, I would expect that every dollar that they need to officially put that last door closed should be going to them. And then next year you would expect that a similar aggregate total budget would then be allocated over the remaining sites to hopefully do the same with the next site.
So we can take that back and take a look at it and see exactly how we might be able to work that in. I think that it might, an understanding of that could probably help you understand a little bit more of the planned life cycle of Savannah River, which would in turn help you understand the integrated priority list.
'Cause
over
there-
time to some
there's a lot of
extent,
ways.
but I don't know.
Zach hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of ways to look at the numbers, and some things look better on paper than when you really get into the details of reality. But I think if we were able to shine some context that if CAB felt we were getting left in the dust, so to speak, we would
Right.
probably view things a little differently and be quite a bit more adamant about certain topics and certain budgetary developments than
We may
we-
be
them
able to
being
do something in
uninformed.
terms of context and providing so that it'll help a little bit. But I want to make sure that when we do that we don't get too far down in the weeds of it because we want to keep you focused on SRS.
I agree.
I think your strategic plan would be a very good fit for this, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Tom?
Tom French, Cab. I think the most difficult thing is understanding when you do aggregate of the site. You get our security, you get our NNSA, you get EM, and we end up talking about, we talk about EM, and our EM budget is not as constrained as other sites' EM budget. But when they look at it from Washington, they see all these other things that come to Savannah River site, right? This big pot, which doesn't necessarily get applied to the missions we're concerned about. And I think, James, that's the hard part of sorting that out. It'd be very good if we could do that. But I think it's that complexity that they see in Washington. They just look at a point, right? They don't necessarily worry about EM missions cleaning up the
Yeah,
site.
And I think along that lines, if it's not the physical data they can share, it kind of comes back to the strategy. What is the strategy?
Yeah.
David?
Dave Levankas, CAB. The numbers I was quoting were just strictly SRS EM. And I think some of the things that were real winners in the FY19 budget is got all the PILT funding that was needed. Got a new security system replacement, Argus, $10 million that wasn't requested. Also got funding for the saltstone disposal units 8 and 9, and got what looks to me design funding for part of that also. So it, I think when you look at when you're trying to do a fair comparison by site, when you look at fiscal year over fiscal year, when you realize that the request that's made in the president's budget, the congressional justification, that's strictly a starting point for Congress. And Congress is going to have all the experts come before it, and there's going to be a lot of debate. There's going to be a lot of conversations with staffers, and they're going to get to hopefully the right answer. They're going to work hard at it. It may not be the answer that everybody agrees with, but they're going to try to do the best job they can to get there. I've worked with them in the past, and I know they're conscientious. So, are there some political considerations at times? Yes, there are. But most of the time, I think there's a lot of integrity in the process, and they do the best job they can, and it's a pretty good process.
Okay.
So.
Jim?
Yeah, I just offer up, listening to some of the conversation here. I think when Zach was identifying this notion of initiatives and options that we're all putting forward as part of this 10-year approach, that there was a leap into, it was a site-level decision on what initiative was going to get funded or not, okay? So I want to be clear that we are all, the different programs at the site, being asked to propose a variety of different initiatives. So the takeaway I've had, and so there are two pieces here, the takeaway I've had is, number one, the process is going to look at whatever may be the best return on investment of those individual initiatives. I don't get a flavor of a site level kind of decision like I'm going to close this site versus that site as part of this process. Number two, I'd just caution that I don't think any of us know what that actual decision plan or formula is at the headquarters level yet for deciding, do I fund this one or do I fund this one? Because it's just as you mentioned, paying off the bills, I might be able to make a big advancement with a small return, but it's just because that's all the cash I got. Or I might be able to get a big bang for the buck if I have that much cash. And, so that part hasn't been decided yet. So I just caution, looking for the answers that says, how are we going to get there, or what is the decision-making process at headquarters? I don't think that has all been formulated yet. Okay, but we've all been challenged. I've been offering up opportunities where I can go accelerate pieces of my program. And so those are all going to converge together at some point, and then that decision's there. I don't think that process is fully defined.
Any more discussion on the topic? All right, we still have no one online, right?
Is there anybody online?
Okay, so moving on to our next committee discussion, EM performance metrics. So Zach, I'll start out while people maybe look at their notes and formulate questions or discussion topics on the presentation itself from last full CAB meeting. I enjoyed it very much. I liked some more of the story that it was telling and some of that history and progress. Stepping into the CAB now 4 years ago, I still feel like I have a ton to learn, but I feel in general that I've learned that the more questions we ask, I think the more typically we get more assured that things are being done well, and we are on a slope. We don't necessarily always agree with the level of progress, but we are on a glide path to completing the EM mission here on site. So thank you very much for helping tell that story. So with that, I'm now going to take a moment and look through my notes on the presentation from the CAB meeting. So if anyone else has something they'd like to bring up, please do so.
Dave Babakis, CAB. Zach, I'm not going to say that there was less transparency this year than with the presentation last year, but I will, looking back at the FY17 presentation, I noticed that there were a number of performance goals, targets that we didn't see in the 18 presentation. The first one I looked at was liquid waste vitrification process, the canisters produced, and I didn't see anything in the presentation about that. I know that's one that didn't make the target in FY17. Then the liquid waste saltstone processing, the thousands of gallons processed. I didn't see that for FY18. I saw in 17, that was another one that we missed the target on. And then I had a question on the spent nuclear fuel. This was slide 13 in your presentation. Let me make sure it's 13. No, it's not 13. This was slide 16 in your presentation. And in end of the year 17, you said that in L Basin inventory, you had 3,088 bundles, and then you transferred 24 to H Canyon, and how do you get to the what's the end of the year? Is that the inventory, the 3211?
I'm sorry, I thought you were going to keep going. But it's my understanding, yes, that's the inventory that we have at the end of the fiscal year. I would have to clarify with Maxine just to make sure, but that's my understanding.
Okay.
Was that all your questions, Dave?
Carlos? Jump.
Carlos Cato, CAB. Zach, could you go into detail about the new WIP waste acceptance criteria?
I am not the person to do that. I think Jim can get us close, but
Yeah, what was the question on the,
Well, I was just curious about the details of the WIP waste acceptance criteria. On slide 14, one of the bullet points highlighted that there was a new WIP acceptance criteria. And I was just curious what those details were and if they could be divulged to the group.
yeah, what we're talking about here is after the 2014 events out at WIP, where they had the drum and they had the fire issue. They went through and redefined waste acceptance criteria for a whole slew of parameters for true waste. And also what they did was, I would say, increase the rigor of inspection to verify that material all meets the WAC, okay? So what we're doing here when we talk about meeting new WIP waste criteria, basically what they said, if you recall, back in about 2014, right now I have about 600 cubic meters. That's about what I had back then of legacy material that had passed through all of those checks, with the exception just ones or twosies to finish out, but it was all done. So basically what had happened was when they revisited their program and said, now what we need to make sure of is all of these additional requirements are met, we basically now have to run that 600 cubic meters back through that series of tests to verify that it does meet their new acceptance criteria. So we've been in that process. We have a bi-weekly phone call with them to go through all the detail to help make sure that that progress is made. I believe one of the presentations we made at one point in FY18, last fiscal year, we supplied over 6,000 documents and records of information of, just all the way from how the procedures, from how the material was packed, to X-ray data, to different isotopic review, all those things that make up, is it acceptable to go in there? Over 6,000 records were provided to WIP to re-verify that our material was good. And, as a result of that, you saw the first shipment in August of yes, checked off, it did meet all that, and we were able to make that shipment. So, but it's a very rigorous process and one that we have to do. I think we have something like 35 to 40 waste streams, individual waste streams, types of material, and each one of those streams has to go through that process. So that's what that's about.
Thank you.
I want to go back to Dave's first two questions before we get too far along. I just want to make sure I understand. On slide 10 and slide 11 in that presentation, we do have those metrics that you were referring to, the canister produced and the saltstone produced. I just wanted to make sure I understood your question. These are different than last year. We didn't have the performance goal with this, but I think, again, my perspective, and tell me if this is not what you want to see, that this is like, looking for your opinion on this. This year, with all the things and all the issues and stuff that were with the liquid waste program, and what I understood as the intent of like, hey, making progress, or like show that we're making progress, show that the job. I mean, we have a goal at the beginning of the year, but that was immediately changed with all the issues that liquid waste had. So we could have had a number up there, but they weren't going to meet that number for this year. We had the amount actually processed throughout the year, and then we just tried to show it again, that longer term picture, that where it looks like we're seeing progress compared to how it has been in years past, where we had a performance goal, a number, and it plus or minus above or below the line.
David Boggs, Captain. Yeah, thank you. That it's good to see that format, but it would also be helpful if we had a standard format for all the performance measures, so that we could just go through them and see what the actuals were for each of the fiscal years, and then what the target was, and then did you meet the target?
Okay, so you like the table as well?
Like the table.
Okay, perfect.
Dave is data, Dan is visual. Right? Pretty much? And I'm good with that. Any other comments or questions on that? Mary.
Mary Weber Cap. I'm going back to your slide 16, spent nuclear fuel receipt and storage. And I'm kind of following up on what Dave was talking about, because the bundles are actually showing a net increase in the inventory between 17 and 18. So I'm wondering, and maybe it's on another slide, what the projection for 19 is. How much do you anticipate receiving, and how much do you anticipate transferring to H Canyon? Because, like I said, there was a net increase last year as opposed to a decrease.
So I don't think Maxine ever goes into the details of like what's all coming in, like, or the amounts. But I'll say it ebbs and flows. I know that, and I think if you go back to the past several years with the performance thing, there's a certain amount of process. We get some throughout the year, and sometimes it's more, and so sometimes it's less than the previous year. I want to, and this, Jim, like, did your outage have any effect on like the amount of processing that they could have done in H Canyon throughout the year, or?
No,
Okay.
our outage didn't affect them, but you're exactly right. I mean, depending on their shipment schedule, don't forget this would represent things like foreign fuel receipts, domestic fuel receipts. So, you know, I don't know how they did their projection. It's kind of interesting because here we have the 1 year kind of snippet, and in liquid waste we kind of gave you a forecast. So
Yeah.
you're right. I appreciate both of the comments. I think we can look at it for consistency. So maybe we can forecast where we can. We'll just have to talk to Maxine and see what they're allowed to talk about and what they're not allowed to talk about. Because, you know, there is sensitivity about what fuel's coming in, how much is coming in, when it's coming in. So they may have a little bit of sensitivity forecasting that I don't have to worry about on the liquid waste side. But we can certainly look at that.
Well, I'm just concerned that we're seeing an increase rather than a decrease.
Well, no, I think and I understand the concern, but the recognition I think here is that the spent fuel program is an active program, still looking at bringing back material. You know, there are domestic research reactors out there that we're going to still be taking fuel from. We're supporting that research activity for some period of time. There's also the foreign fuel receipts that, you know, as part of the national program to bring that material back from a non-proliferation concern, we're going to continue to work on. So that is an active program. And as Zach said, that will be how much net you have is a function of how well the canyon is operating to dissolve that fuel and process that fuel, and a function of how many shipments are planned. You know, I worked that program a long time ago, and you might have one shipment planned, you might have 10 shipments planned. It's very, you know, a very vibrant process, I'll say, or program that a lot of those things are outside your control, as well as when you'll get those in, because they're based on so many foreign factors of shipping and everything else.
And Mary, along the same lines, Dan Kaminsky Cap. Yeah, I agree. There's plenty of tweaking and recommendations that I feel we can have added into this presentation. You know, and some of it obviously could be allowable. Some of it, I know there's sensitivity about dates of shipments and things like that. But one of the things that I think for particularly the newer cab members that are going to be here for quite a while, I hope, is watching how the graphs on page 11 actually start taking hold. And, you know, as even DHEC stated in the last full cab, DHEC's thrilled to see that our infrastructure is about to pretty much all come online to make some very big progress here at the site. And I think that's been a long lead up. We've had certainly mega amounts of delays getting us to where we are today. Good reasons and bad reasons for sure. But that being said, that's kind of why I was adamant about trying to see this more graphically, so that we can see where they're supposed to be heading, and not that we're the watchdog to make sure they get every job done, but us as interested citizens, we want to know that they're making progress. And I think it'll be very easy next year if members of the cabin, a couple years after that even, that if we're falling well below that line, I think there's a lot of answering to be done, because a lot of this infrastructure really should be leading up to this line. And so I'm highly optimistic that helps a lot of people like me see it graphically, so that we can understand: are we on track, falling behind, are we ahead of the game, what are we doing? And then, devil in the details when you start looking at specific ebb and flows of spent nuclear fuel, for instance. We know that happens, and certainly I would suspect some of the outages and things that happened in H Canyon certainly would have impacted how many you would be able to do this last year. I don't honestly know what was planned for the canyon this last year, and maybe that is of interest to this committee if we want to have it added. I think that's a metrics that we certainly, at minimum, ask for, and you don't get it until you ask for it. So, by all means. And I also, to encourage this committee, there's a lot to digest here. There's pros and cons to every way you put data, and there's also lots of good ideas that may not come to you in the last 2 weeks from seeing it in a new format. But that being said, this is a continuing discussion with Zach, and they've been very receptive to feedback and discussion on this topic of what we want the metrics to look like. And I don't think we're 100% perfect. We never are. There's always something more we can do. But as we get some good ideas along the way, let's chime in and work with our point of contact and bring it online. So, Dave, you have your question card up.
Dave Babakis, Cab. Zach, on slide 15, the transuranic waste, I see that the true legacy shipped cumulative to date is 10,686. And I see the actual for 18 is 9. So just doing the subtraction, I would think that the cumulative to date through 17 was 10,677, right? But if I look back at last year's presentation, I see that the cumulative to date through 17 was 10,450. So we picked up, over 200 cubic meters there somehow that aren't explained year over year. Do you, is that one you have to take back also, or?
Yeah, I don't have, I have what the 17 actual is right there on that table.
Right.
I'd have to go back and look at the presentation and then go talk to.
10,450 was what you had in last year's
No,
presentation.
I believe you.
Right.
Okay. I'd have to go back and look and talk to them.
And the same for the next line item, true newly generated shipped. It says the cumulative to date is 84 0 shipped in 18, but when you look at the cumulative to date in your FY17 presentation through FY17 was 177. So I don't know how we went from 177 to 84. So
yeah, so what I'll do is I'll talk to the program point of contact on that, and we'll get you an answer on. I'll look at it and make sure like what you're sounding like or what you're saying to me without looking at it does sound like a discrepancy. So I'll look at it. We'll figure out what happened there, and we'll get you an answer. Okay,
thank you. And I had another one on slide 20. it says, all the way to the right, it says 2018 completed D area ash basin. And when I look back at last year, we were only 79% complete on that. And the actual for FY17 was only 3. So we must, so it needed to go from 408 to 515. So must have done a bang-up job in FY18 to get that completed.
When you say the 408 to 515, are you talking the waste units? What are numbers you're referring to right there?
This is unit of measure. It says waste sites, remediation of waste sites, and cumulative to date through 17 was 408. In 17, there were 3 waste sites that were completed. The end state is 515, and it was 79% complete. So I'm trying to figure out how did we manage to complete that in 18 when we only did 3 in 17 and we did 5 in 16. That was, pretty impressive if that happened.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look the year over year to understand exactly what you're saying. I just don't have it in front of me.
Dan Kaminsky, CAB. It's my understanding that those numbers were the actual number of sites that needed to be cleaned up on the site. So there was a total of 515, and cumulative to date, they had cleaned and closed 408. So in this particular rendering, I think, obviously, that we didn't get to the 515. We got the 409, 410, or whatever by closing the site in D area. That was my take on that.
Okay.
Does that sound right?
That's my understanding, but I will confirm just to make sure.
But the slide last year was for D area.
Well, I think last year's slide, they had a sample project picture at the top, and then they were talking about the aggregate number of sites. So it wasn't talking that there was 515 sites in D area. I think a casual glance can certainly throw some confusion in there because of the single project being shown. And then this year's slide 20 shows different projects and the different time periods that those were closed. So did the new presentation also reiterate the cumulative number of sites?
Yeah, it's
on a different slide.
It's on
I know we went over
the slide by the map. It's at the bottom right of the presentation.
On which slide?
Right there. Total 515.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And we're at mechanically completed of, wasn't that the term used for D area or something like that? There was a technical word in front of completed.
You're right, and I don't remember
So it's
exactly.
not 100% closed yet. I'm sure there's paperwork to, because otherwise that number should have changed from 408 to 409.
I know Angela, she felt comfortable saying construction, or not construction, but completed, but there is my understanding there is still some activities and stuff going on. I'm not exactly sure if that's paperwork or monitoring or but that's something what we can find out.
Yeah, I forget the term that was used, but it was something like mechanically closed or something. So I think it's functionally closed. I think we just now have the finishing touches.
That's right, because the contractor is demobilizing and leaving the area. They're like with any job, there is probably some I don't want to say a punch list, but there's things that they're taking care of as they're leaving. But
okay, thanks. Carlos, did you still have a question?
No. I just wanted clarification on which slide it was. I thought you guys were referring to slide 19.
Okay. Yeah, we've been pinging between this year's and last year's, so it's getting really confusing on my side. Any more comments, questions, concerns? Doesn't have to be a finished subject. As we get good ideas, let's bring them back up in future committees, please. All right, moving on to the National Environmental Research Park. Once again, I'd like to thank Tom French for having been the fly on the wall and bugging my ear to get this on our work plan this year, so thank you, Tom. I had no idea what the man was talking about last January, but I'm glad I listened because I was really impressed with NERP and the opportunities at this site, so thank you, Tom. And we do have a recommendation drafted that hopefully everyone had a chance to read. It really summarizes a great deal of what Dr. Rhodes had presented, and Dr. Rhodes was nice enough to recap some specific needs that they wanted to hear what the CAB had to say. So kudos to Dr. Rhodes on that, please. Are there any discussion topics or questions with regards to the presentation?
I'll make a comment if I might.
Tom?
This is Tom French Cab. I've been talking to Gene over the past 6 months because when when I still worked at this site, I had a very deep interest in the NERP and how important it is ecologically for the study of the humid environment on the East Coast. It's a unique opportunity in the whole United States. And it also compares with other DOE sites. The Hanford site is a NERP. It's very much high desert. It's a total opposite of this, different ecological systems, but the impacts can be seen at both sites. So that's why I have a very strong interest in if we can revitalize the NERP, get some more money back into it. It's ecological information that we can't replace anywhere else. And I don't know that everybody has had the opportunities that I've had. If you go out and tour the site, you'll be amazed at what a diverse ecological platform is out there. Pristine creeks, beautiful forest. It's not all pines. There's lots of hardwood forest there. It's a unique ecology in the southeast because it's been untouched for 50 years. And if the ecology lab did those 30 base studies, and if you could add pollinators to it and update them, you'd have a huge amount of information about the impacts of running a site or leaving it pristine. So that's why I'm sort of passionate about this. That's why I wrote the recommendation. And Gene is a really great guy. He's really tuned into this, so he's a great person to be the sponsor for it.
So I personally didn't have any huge notes or concerns out of the NERP other than I knew, in fact, Tom actually beat me to the punch because I did have some notes as I was reviewing it on the backside of what Dr. Rhodes had looked for some advice and some needs. So Tom is kind of working us right into our draft recommendation. So it's all same topic, so let's go ahead and continue on that evolutionary discussion. Tom, I am not going to force you to read this out loud. We're all grown-ups, and but cutting to the chase with regards to the 3 recommendations that you had drafted. There was a sidebar comment from me via email that, hang on one moment, James was nice enough to give me a quick view of what I had written. So I get my thoughts. Oops, here we go. So I was looking at this, and one thing that I felt out of the recommendations that you didn't completely touch upon was the database. And so a lot of things are all about data. So you look like you had a aha, I wanted to say something moment there, Tom. But my only concern was we could do all this, and if we don't get the data and make it shareable and searchable, it could end up being for naught. A moment in time we would know all the wisdom, and then blink and it's all gone.
And I agree with you, Dan. Number 3 was to get at that. And the reason I wrote it that way rather than the way Gene wrote it is when Gene says databases, he means databases. And they're pretty dense if you've seen the college databases. And I was trying to get to, they need to make it a little bit higher level so that if Tom or Mary or whoever wanted to go in and look, we could go in and see what was happening and understand it, as opposed to head counts on salamanders or whatever.
Okay.
That's what I was trying to do. But I agree with you. It needs to be available.
Okay, so maybe taking both those concerns into one
We can rewrite that.
Yeah, just a couple words tossed in, perhaps.
Yeah.
Did anyone else have any other edits they'd like to see or recommendations on this recommendation? Mary?
Mary Weber Cab. We talked about it briefly after the presentation, and I'm so glad you jumped in and did this because it was just asking to be written. So thank you for doing it.
Yeah, I also agree with that. Thank you, Tom.
And we've had, I use kind of weasel words about DOE supporting the ecology labs, but we all know that means funding and agreeing on what that scope is. But with the opportunity to include graduate students, PhDs, there's a lot of things that you could get back out of this investment to the DOE folks.
So Tom, just Dan Kaminsky Cab, just discussing number 3 a little bit, making sure that this knowledge is more available to the public. You have any ideas to point DOE in a direction? We were just talking about the ACER at the last committee meeting, and that's something that is, somewhat of a struggle in the sense that it's out there online or it's in limited print format, and I feel that they don't necessarily know and understand how many hits they get on their sites and how much of are meaningful hits versus internal hits, and then how to make this available. So did you have any ideas on that, or leaving it to them?
This is Tom French Cap. I had talked to Gene about that, and Gene is very much the good scientist. And I was saying, so how can we make it available to local communities? And Gene was going, well, maybe we could do outreach programs like they do PETA, when they have the annual thing where the kids come out to the animals. Then you could do a NERP day where people would come out and experience what is a NERP and why is it important and what's out there, what are the significant creatures on the site. Because they do have one for kids. They just could have one for adults. But I agree with you. If you could make it available online and you could count who's using it, it'd be fantastic. So if you have any ideas, Dan, how to rewrite that.
Well, I only had the idea on the database side, and you're right. Database from a data standpoint, big data, like you said, is only going to interest so many people. That wouldn't necessarily be the general public.
Right.
At least I don't know too many people who love poring over, that sort of detail.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any thoughts on kind of merging those ideas at the table? Any creative? Could maybe the suggestion be through outreach programs and a database?
Yeah, that'd be a good addition.
So maybe add a sentence at the end. This may be accomplished via public outreach and educational database or something.
Doug Howard Cap, do they discuss the NERP during the public tours?
No.
No. Kristen's shaking her head no.
I mean, is that something that could be another outlet of?
And so you might include that into the public outreach.
Yeah, public outreach.
Right, that's what I was talking
So
about.
that would be something where you might be getting a little bit too
In the weeds.
into the weeds over it. You want to keep it high level. Let them figure out the best way to do it. You want to make your keywords here that you want it accessible to the public and you want it accessible to the scientific community. And those are very different populations. And so if you get too lengthy, specific document that the department may not be able to respond favorably to because it's too specific.
But public outreach should cover that, I think.
I think through,
Yeah, and that was the
you had that
question
term
I
through
was
public
Yeah, that's
outreach
pretty
and
generic.
educational
Yeah, that was
database
the
and
question
drop
I was
there.
asking.
Kristen, did you want to add a couple comments?
Yeah.
Sorry, Kristen Hewer, SRS. The public tours all go to the ecology lab. So at that point, they give an overview presentation of the ecology lab and a high-level view of all the work they do on the site, and then go into a live animal demonstration. So that would be their opportunity to share that information.
So see, it would be incumbent upon them to share that. And if they have a fancy new baseline of all the research in animal life and everything. They're going to share that. You know, you got to imagine that why wouldn't they talk about that?
Okay.
It's good.
Looking good.
Yeah. So do you want to just, with your addition, take that to the, I'm not sure about the process, take it to the full board?
Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second? Okay. Show of hands, those wishing to take this full board for review and approval. Motion carries. So thank you, Tom.
All right.
They may ask you to read the
Oh,
at the full cap.
So I have to tell you, when I read Gene's slides, he's got a lot of good information in there. And then I went up online, and I didn't realize how much stuff's been written about the NERP since 1972. And I tried to extract those pieces that actually happened, not our plans for. And hopefully I got that kind of right. So when you read it, you kind of get the history and why they meant to do this in the first place. So.
Okay. Very good. Any other discussion around the table?
Just a quick, Dave Lavacas, Cap. All of the publications that come out of here now, are they all scholarly works, or are they?
So the documents that were the baseline documents, Dave, and I have not read them, all 30 of them, but they're basically readable baseline documents describing amphibians, turtles, whatever, right? Fishes. And so if they're not light reading, but they're readable. Does that make sense? And they're available. They're available online, I believe. The problem is they just haven't been updated in like 10 years. That's the difficulty. And Dan and I had swapped emails, and I think this is a perfect opportunity. Looking at areas that have been undisturbed for 50 years and going in there and studying and seeing what's there versus what's out on the power lines or whatever.
All right. With nothing else, I'd invite everyone to join us at our next committee meeting on April 17th. You'll meet your new chair at that point, right? And hopefully see everybody in January. So with that,
You're going to ask for public comment.
I'm going to ask for public comments. What I'm going to ask for.
There may not be any, but
I see no public.
and keep in mind, folks, please don't write this date down on your calendar. It is a tentative date until things are finalized with the work plan in February.
David, you got
And I apologize for this. Dave Lavacas, Cap. I just wanted to revisit one thing on the performance measures again. When I went out on the EM website today, I see that EM has site-specific performance measures out there, and they list estimates for the life cycle. They list actuals for pre-2018, and then they have targets for 18 and 19. Are those the same that as SRS tries to measure to, or are they the same metrics that you guys would use, or is this what you've shown us in your presentation? Is that a whole different set of metrics? Because I can't compare a lot of the numbers that I saw out there with what you've shown us.
Yeah, so I know this is going to sound like I'm punting the ball, but I'm definitely going to have to look at that website and figure out exactly what you're talking about. Because to your point, there's so many performance metrics out there. There's so many goals. There's so many different things depending on the website and who you talk to, and they're not all the same. This is our attempt, and it's not necessarily like we can take adjustments. These are what we thought were the essential missions and what everything drives towards. If there's like a different area that you maybe want to see progress or like measure progress in, that's something that we can entertain and see if we can work in. But if you could send that website or the link to James, and I'll look at it, and I can tell you like how that meshes in with what we have, or I can say I've never seen that before in my life.
I'll just give it to you. And sorry
Okay.
that I didn't ask this earlier, but
No,
I just
no worries.
had it on the bottom of my pile. So
sort of
thank you.
drooling over that. That's pretty interesting. That was on the DOE.
That's on the EM.
Is it listed under metrics, EM metrics?
Yes, and
Okay.
but it lists all the sites,
Okay.
and they all have their own, but they're all, they're standard performance measures for each site.
Thank you, Tom. I'm sorry, David. With that, any other discussion around the table? This meeting is adjourned. Travel safely.